The afternoon sun was beating down on Maple Street when everything changed. It was one of those quiet Tuesday afternoons where nothing much happens in suburbia. Kids were still at school, parents were at work, and the neighborhood felt peaceful. And Konga Betty had been living in this same house for almost 40 years. She knew every family, every dog, and practically every delivery truck that came down their street. At 65, she spent most of her time tending to her beautiful garden and keeping an eye on the neighborhood. She wasn't nosy, she told herself, just caring about her community that day. She was outside watering her roses when she spotted someone she had never seen before. A young boy, maybe 14 or 15 years old, was walking slowly down the sidewalk. He kept stopping and looking at different houses, which immediately caught her attention. The boy seemed lost. He would pause at one house, look at the numbers, then move to the next one. He had a backpack slung over his shoulder and kept checking something in his hand. Though Betty couldn't see what it was from her distance, what made Betty uncomfortable wasn't just that she didn't recognize him. There had been some break-ins in the neighboring area recently, and the local news had been talking about it for weeks. The police had even sent out flyers asking residents to report any suspicious activity. As she watched, the boy stopped at the Hendersons' house across the street. He stood there for a long moment, looking at their front door and windows. Then he moved to the next house and did the same thing. Betty felt her heart rate pick up. The boy was tall for his age and was wearing a dark hoodie despite the warm weather. To Betty, this seemed odd. Why would someone wear a hoodie on such a hot day unless they were trying to hide their face? She had seen enough crime shows to know that this was what burglars did when they were checking out houses to rob. Later, she put down her watering can and moved closer to her fence to get a better look. The boy was now standing in front of the Williams house, and they were both at work. Their house looked empty, which made Betty even more worried. The boy pulled out what looked like a piece of paper from his pocket and seemed to be comparing it to the house numbers. But from Betty's perspective, it looked like he was taking notes or making some kind of plan. Her imagination started running wild with all the possibilities of what he might be planning. Betty had always considered herself a good neighbor. She had organized block parties, helped elderly residents with their groceries, and even started a neighborhood watch program 3 years ago. She genuinely cared about keeping everyone safe, and right now, her instincts were telling her something wasn't right. The boy continued his slow walk down the street, stopping at each house and studying them carefully. When he reached the corner house where old Mr. Peterson lived alone, Betty made her decision. Mr. Peterson was in his 80s and would be no match for a young intruder. She quickly walked back to her house and picked up her phone. Her hands were shaking a little as she dialed. She had never called the police before for something like this, but she felt she had no choice. Hello? Police department? I need to report some suspicious activity in my neighborhood, she said when the operator answered. What type of suspicious activity, ma'am? There's a young man walking around our street, and he's been looking at different houses for about 15 minutes now. He keeps stopping and staring at each house like he's planning something. We've had some break-ins in the area recently, and I'm worried he might be checking out houses to rob later. The operator asked for more details about the location and the person she was reporting. Betty gave them her address and described what she was seeing as best as she could. We'll send an officer to check it out, the operator assured her. After hanging up, Betty felt a mix of relief and nervousness. She hoped she was doing the right thing. She didn't want to get an innocent person in trouble, but she also couldn't ignore what seemed like obvious criminal behavior. She went back to her window to continue watching. The boy was now near the end of the street, still doing the same thing. He would stop, look at a house carefully, check his paper, and then move on. To Betty, this pattern confirmed her suspicions. Within just a few minutes, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Her heart started beating faster. She had really done it. She had called the police on someone. Part of her wondered if she had overreacted, but then she reminded herself of all the break-ins that had been happening. The police car turned onto their street, with its lights flashing. Betty watched as it slowly drove toward where the boy was standing. She felt vindicated in her decision. The police would figure out what was really going on, and if the boy was innocent, then no harm would be done. The boy seemed startled when he saw the police car approaching. He stopped walking and looked around as if he was confused about why the police were there. This reaction made Betty feel even more certain that something was wrong. Why would an innocent person look so nervous when they saw police? As the police car pulled over, Betty noticed some of her neighbors starting to come outside to see what was happening. Mrs. Chun from next door stepped onto her porch, and Mr. Roberts across the street opened his front door to peek out. The police officer got out of the car and approached the boy. Even from her distance, Betty could see that the conversation looked serious. The officer was asking questions, and the boy was trying to explain something. But Betty couldn't hear what they were saying. More neighbors started gathering on their porches and front yards. This kind of excitement was rare in their quiet neighborhood, and everyone was curious about what was happening. Betty felt a strange mix of pride and worry. She was proud that she had acted to protect her neighborhood, but she was also starting to feel a little anxious about the attention the situation was getting. She hoped she had made the right choice. The boy was showing the police officer something, probably the piece of paper she had seen him looking at earlier. The officer was examining it carefully while asking more questions. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Davidson, the retired teacher who lived at the end of the street, came rushing out of her house. She looked upset and was heading straight toward where the police officer and the boy were standing. Betty couldn't hear what Mrs. Davidson was saying, but she seemed to know the boy. This surprised Betty because Mrs. Davidson had lived in the neighborhood for years, and Betty thought she knew all of her friends and family. The situation was getting more complicated, and Betty was starting to feel uncomfortable. Maybe there was more to this story than she had realized. But it was too late now. She had already called the police, and they were handling the situation. As she watched the scene unfold, Betty couldn't shake the feeling that she might have misunderstood something important. The boy didn't look like a criminal now that she could see him more clearly. He looked scared and confused, which wasn't exactly how she would expect a burglar to act when caught. But then again, she reasoned with herself, criminals could be good actors, and she had definitely seen him behaving suspiciously. She had done what any responsible neighbor would do in the same situation. The crowd of neighbors was growing larger, and Betty could see people talking among themselves and pointing toward the scene. She wondered what they were all thinking and whether they would have made the same choice she had made. Little did Betty know that in just a few minutes, someone would arrive who would completely change her understanding of the situation and make her question everything she thought she knew about what she had witnessed that afternoon. Officer Linda Rodriguez had only been on the police force for 8 months. She was still learning how to handle different situations, and every call made her a little nervous. When the dispatch came through about suspicious activity on Maple Street, she thought it would be a routine check that would be over quickly. As she pulled up to the scene, she could see a young boy standing on the sidewalk looking confused and worried. He appeared to be around 14 years old, and when he saw the police car, his eyes went wide with surprise and fear. Linda got out of her car and approached the boy slowly. She had been trained to stay calm and assess situations carefully. But something about the boy's reaction made her feel like this might be more complicated than a simple case of someone being in the wrong place. "Good afternoon," she said, trying to keep her voice friendly but professional. "I'm Officer Rodriguez. I received a call about someone acting suspiciously in this neighborhood. Can you tell me what you're doing here?" The boy looked around nervously, as if he was trying to figure out where the call had come from. "I'm just looking for a house," he said quietly. "I'm supposed to meet my tutor, but I can't find the right address." Linda studied his face carefully. He seemed genuinely confused and scared, not like someone who had been caught doing something wrong. But she had learned in training that appearances could be deceiving, and she needed to gather more information. "What's your name?" she asked, pulling out her notepad. "Danny," the boy replied. "Danny Thompson. I go to Lincoln High School." "Okay." "Danny, can you show me some identification?" Danny reached into his backpack, moving slowly because he could tell the officer was watching his every move. He pulled out his student ID card and handed it to her. Linda examined the ID carefully. Everything seemed to match up. The photo looked like him, and the school was local. But she still needed to understand why someone had called the police about him. The person who called said you were looking at houses in a suspicious way. Can you explain what you were doing? Danny's face showed relief, as if he finally understood why he was in trouble. Oh, that's because I was trying to find house number 847. My phone died, and I couldn't use the GPS anymore. I've been walking around for like 20 minutes trying to find the right house. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper with an address written on it. See? My mom wrote down the address for me. Mrs. Patterson is supposed to help me with math before my big test next week. Linda looked at the paper. It clearly showed an address on this street, and the handwriting looked like something a parent would write for their child. But she had to be thorough. By now, more neighbors had come outside to see what was happening. Linda could see people standing on their porches and gathering in small groups, all watching the interaction with curiosity. Betty was still watching from her front yard, feeling more confident about her decision to call the police. To her, it looked like the officer was doing exactly what she should do, asking questions and checking the boy's story. Which house are you looking for? Linda asked Danny. Danny looked at his paper again and pointed down the street. 847. It should be somewhere over there, but I can't see the numbers very well on some of the houses. Just then, Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher who lived at 847, came rushing out of her house. She had noticed the police car and was worried that something had happened in her neighborhood. When she saw Danny standing with the police officer, she immediately understood what was happening, and she was not happy about it. Officer, what is going on here? Mrs. Patterson demanded as she walked quickly toward them. This is my student, Danny. He's supposed to be at my house right now for his tutoring session. Linda felt a wave of relief and embarrassment wash over her. It was becoming clear that this was just a big misunderstanding, but she still had to handle the situation properly. Ma'am, we received a call about suspicious activity. I was just checking to make sure everything was okay. Linda explained. Mrs. Patterson looked around at all the neighbors who were watching and then back at Danny, who looked embarrassed and upset. She had been a teacher for 35 years, and she had seen this kind of thing happen before. This is ridiculous, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice getting louder. This boy was just looking for my house. There's nothing suspicious about a student trying to find his tutor. More neighbors started moving closer to hear what was happening. The situation was attracting more attention than Linda was comfortable with, and she could feel the tension in the air rising. Danny looked like he wanted to disappear. He had never been stopped by police before, and having all these people staring at him made him feel awful. He kept looking around at all the faces watching him, wondering what they were thinking. I understand your concern, ma'am, Linda said to Mrs. Patterson. I'm just doing my job and following up on the call we received. Well, your job is done then, Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. This boy has done nothing wrong except try to find my house for a tutoring appointment that his mother set up. Betty, who had been watching from a distance, began to feel uncomfortable. She could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice getting louder, and it was becoming clear that the boy really was just looking for the teacher's house. But she also felt like she needed to defend her decision to call the police. She walked over to the group, feeling nervous but determined to explain herself. Officer, I'm the one who called, Betty said, trying to keep her voice steady. I saw him walking around and looking at houses for a long time. With all the break-ins that have been happening, I thought it was better to be safe than sorry. Mrs. Patterson turned to look at Betty with an expression of disbelief and anger. Betty, you called the police on a 14-year-old boy who was just trying to find my house? How could you think that was necessary? Danny looked at Betty and she could see the hurt in his eyes. He wasn't angry, but he looked sad and confused about why someone would think he was dangerous just for walking down the street. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood, Betty stammered. I didn't know he was your student. He was acting suspiciously. Suspiciously? Mrs. Patterson repeated. He was looking for house numbers. How is that suspicious? More neighbors had gathered around now, and Linda could see that the situation was getting out of hand. People were starting to take sides, and voices were getting raised. Some neighbors seemed to support Betty's decision to call the police. Mr. Wilson nodded in agreement and said, "Better safe than sorry, I always say." But others looked uncomfortable with what was happening. Mrs. Chun whispered to her husband, "That poor boy looks so scared." Linda realized she needed to take control of the situation before it got worse. "Everyone, please step back and let me handle this," she said in her most authoritative voice. She turned to Danny, who was looking more upset by the minute. "Danny, I'm sorry about this confusion. It looks like this was just a misunderstanding. Mrs. Patterson has confirmed that you're her student, and I can see that you have the correct address written down." Danny nodded but didn't say anything. He was still processing the fact that someone had called the police just for watching him walk down the street. Mrs. Patterson put her hand on Danny's shoulder protectively. "This is exactly the kind of thing I worry about," she said, looking directly at Betty. "This boy is one of my best students. He's polite, hardworking, and has never caused any trouble. But someone decided he looked suspicious just because they didn't recognize him." Betty felt her face getting red. She was starting to realize that maybe she had made a mistake, but she also didn't want to admit that she had been wrong in front of all these people. "I was just being careful," she said defensively. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, Betty," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Not everyone would have called the police on a child who was clearly just lost and looking for an address." The tension in the air was thick. Danny stood in the middle of it all, feeling like everyone was talking about him, but not really seeing him as a real person with feelings. Linda decided it was time to wrap up the situation. "All right, everyone. This appears to be a misunderstanding. Danny, you're free to go to your tutoring appointment. Mrs. Patterson, thank you for clearing this up." But just as Linda thought the situation was over, another car pulled up to the curb. A man in medical scrubs got out, looking concerned and slightly out of breath. The expression on his face when he saw his son standing surrounded by police and neighbors was something that would stay with everyone who witnessed it forever. Dr. James Thompson had just finished a very difficult surgery when his phone started buzzing with missed calls. He was still in his scrubs, washing his hands, when he finally saw the messages. His wife had called 3 times, and there was a text that made his heart skip a beat. "Police called about Danny. Go to Maple Street now." Without stopping to change clothes or ask questions, he ran to his car and drove as fast as he safely could to the address his wife had sent him. His mind was racing with possibilities. Was Danny hurt? Had something terrible happened? The 20-minute drive felt like hours. When he turned onto Maple Street, he could see a crowd of people gathered around a police car. His heart sank when he spotted his son standing in the middle of it all, looking small and scared among all the adults. Dr. Thompson parked quickly and got out of his car, still wearing his surgical scrubs with his hospital ID badge clearly visible. Several people in the crowd immediately recognized him. He was well known in the community, not just as a doctor, but as someone who volunteered at school events and helped organize charity drives. "Danny?" he called out as he walked quickly toward the group. His son's face lit up with relief when he saw his father. "Dad, I was just trying to find Mrs. Patterson's house for tutoring, and someone called the police on me." Dr. Thompson felt a mix of anger and sadness wash over him, but he kept his voice calm and controlled. Years of working in high-pressure medical situations had taught him how to stay composed even when his emotions were running high. "Officer," he said, approaching Linda with a professional manner, "I'm Dr. Thompson, Danny's father. Can you please explain to me what's happening here?" Linda felt immediately relieved to see an adult who could help sort out the situation, but she also felt embarrassed about how everything had unfolded. "Dr. Thompson, there was a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. I was just following up on the report." "Suspicious activity?" Dr. Thompson repeated, looking around at all the neighbors who were still watching. "What kind of suspicious activity?" Betty, who had been standing quietly in the background since Mrs. Patterson had confronted her, felt like she needed to speak up. She recognized Dr. Thompson from the hospital where her late husband had been treated, And suddenly she felt even worse about the whole situation. "I called the police," Betty said, her voice much quieter than before. "I saw Danny walking around the neighborhood, stopping at different houses, and I thought he might be planning to break into someone's home." Dr. Thompson looked at Betty for a long moment before responding. He knew who she was. She had always been polite when they had encountered each other around town. But right now, he was struggling to understand how she could have thought his son was a criminal. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, using her formal name instead of the casual greeting he usually gave her. "My son was looking for his tutor's house. His phone died, so he couldn't use the GPS. He was checking house numbers." The crowd of neighbors was growing larger as more people came out to see what was happening. Some people looked embarrassed. Others seemed curious, and a few appeared uncomfortable with the entire situation. Mrs. Patterson, who had been standing protectively near Danny, spoke up again. "Dr. Thompson, I'm so sorry this happened. Danny is one of my best students. He was supposed to be at my house 20 minutes ago for math help." Dr. Thompson nodded at Mrs. Patterson gratefully, then turned back to Officer Rodriguez. "So let me understand this correctly. My son was stopped by police for the crime of looking for house numbers while being lost?" Linda shifted uncomfortably. When he put it that way, the whole situation sounded even worse than it already was. "Sir, I was responding to a call. I have. To investigate any reports of suspicious activity?" "I understand you were doing your job, officer," Dr. Thompson replied. "But I need to understand what exactly seemed suspicious about a 14-year-old boy walking down a sidewalk in broad daylight." Danny had been listening to the adults talk about him, and he was starting to feel angry instead of just scared. "Dad, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just looking for the right house number. Some of the numbers are hard to see because of the plants in front of them." Dr. Thompson put his hand on his son's shoulder. He could see how upset Danny was, and his heart broke a little more. This was not how he wanted his son to learn about how the world sometimes worked. Mr. Roberts, one of the neighbors who had been watching from across the street, walked over to the group. "Dr. Thompson, I saw the whole thing. The boy was clearly just looking for an address. He had a piece of paper in his hand and everything." "Thank you, Mr. Roberts," Dr. Thompson said. He appreciated that at least someone had been paying attention to what was actually happening instead of jumping to conclusions. Mrs. Chun, who lived next door to Betty, also stepped forward. "I feel terrible about this. I saw Danny walking around, but I could tell he was just lost. I should have offered to help him instead of just watching." Betty was listening to all of this and feeling worse by the minute. She could see that several of her neighbors had seen the same thing she had seen, but they had understood it differently. They had seen a lost teenager, while she had seen a potential criminal. "Dr. Thompson," Betty said, taking a step closer to him, "I want to apologize. I made a mistake. I was scared because of all the break-ins that have been happening, and I didn't think clearly." Dr. Thompson looked at Betty, and she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand that you were concerned about safety, but my son is a child. He's a good kid who gets good grades and stays out of trouble. What exactly did you see that made you think he was dangerous?" Betty felt her face burning with shame. When she tried to think about what she had actually seen, she realized it wasn't very much. Danny walking slowly, looking at houses, checking a piece of paper. None of those things were actually suspicious when she really thought about it. I don't know," she admitted. "I guess I just got scared and didn't think it through." Mrs. Patterson looked around at all the neighbors who were gathered. "This is exactly what I worry about when I see how some people treat my students. Danny is a wonderful boy who works hard in school and respects everyone he meets. But someone decided he looked dangerous just because they didn't recognize him." Some of the neighbors started looking uncomfortable and began walking back toward their houses. They had come out to see what the excitement was about, but now the situation felt too serious and personal for casual observation. Dr. Thompson could see that his son was getting more upset as the conversation continued. Danny was trying to hold back tears, and his father knew he needed to get him away from this situation soon. "Officer Rodriguez," Dr. Thompson said, Is my son free to go to his tutoring appointment now? Yes, sir, Linda replied quickly. There are no charges or anything like that. This was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Dr. Thompson repeated slowly. That's an interesting way to describe it. He turned to address the neighbors who were still gathered around. I want everyone here to understand something. My son has lived in this community his whole life. He goes to school here, plays sports here, and has friends here. But today, someone decided he didn't belong just because they didn't recognize him. The crowd was mostly quiet now. Even the people who had initially supported Betty's decision to call the police were starting to feel uncomfortable about how the situation had developed. This isn't just about my son, Dr. Thompson continued. This is about how we treat each other as neighbors and community members. When we see someone we don't recognize, do we assume the worst, or do we try to understand what's really happening? Denny looked up at his father with admiration. Even though he was upset and embarrassed, he was proud of how his dad was handling the situation. He wasn't yelling or being mean to anyone, but he was making sure everyone understood how wrong this had been. Betty felt like everyone was looking at her, judging her for her mistake. She wanted to say something else to make it better somehow, but she didn't know what words could fix what had happened. Mrs. Patterson walked over to Danny and gave him a gentle hug. I'm so sorry this happened to you, sweetie. Are you still up for working on math problems, or would you rather go home and do this another day? Danny looked at his father, who nodded encouragingly. I still want to study, Mrs. Patterson. I don't want to fall behind because of this. Dr. Thompson felt proud of his son's resilience, but he also felt sad that Danny had to be so mature about such an unfair situation. As the crowd began to break up, Dr. Thompson realized that this moment was bigger than just this one incident. This was a teaching moment for the entire community, and he wasn't going to let it pass without making sure everyone understood what had really happened here today. Officer Rodriguez looked around at the crowd of neighbors and realized that this situation had become much bigger than just a simple police call. She could see the tension in everyone's faces and knew she needed to address what had happened properly before leaving. I want to apologize to everyone involved, Linda said, speaking loud enough for all the neighbors to hear. This call should have been handled differently from the beginning. Danny, I'm sorry you had to go through this experience. Danny nodded, politely, though he still looked upset. His father squeezed his shoulder supportively, proud of how mature his son was being despite everything that had happened. Dr. Thompson, Linda continued, I should have recognized right away that this was just a young man looking for an address. In the future, I'll make sure to ask more questions before treating someone as suspicious. Dr. Thompson appreciated the apology, but he knew that this moment was about more than just one police officer's mistake. This was about how their entire community thought about and treated people who looked different or unfamiliar. As Officer Rodriguez got back in her car and drove away, the remaining neighbors stood around awkwardly, not sure what to say or do next. The excitement was over, but the uncomfortable feelings remained. Betty stood apart from the group, feeling terrible about what she had caused. She kept looking at Danny and his father, wanting to say something more, but not knowing how to fix the damage she had done. Mrs. Patterson broke the silence. Danny, why don't we go inside and get started on your math work? I know this has been a difficult afternoon, but we still have that test to prepare for. Actually, Dr. Thompson said gently, could we talk for just a few more minutes? I think this is an important moment for our community, and I don't want to waste it. He looked around at the neighbors who were still standing nearby. Some were starting to walk back to their houses, but many remained curious about what he wanted to say. I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, Dr. Thompson began. Danny was 6 years old when we moved here. He's grown up on these streets, playing with neighborhood kids, riding his bike, walking to school. But today was the first time someone looked at him and saw a threat instead of a child. Mrs. Chun nodded sadly. Dr. Thompson, I feel so bad that this happened. I saw Danny walking around, and I could tell he was just looking for something. I should have offered to help. Thank you, Mrs. Chun, Dr. Thompson replied. But you're not the problem here. The problem is that we don't really know each other as well as we think we do. He gestured toward the houses around them. How many of us actually know all of our neighbors? How many of us would recognize each other's children or grandchildren if we saw them walking down the street? Mr. Roberts, who had spoken up earlier to defend Danny, stepped forward. You're right, Doc. I've lived here for 15 years, but I probably couldn't tell you the names of half the families on this street. Betty finally found the courage to speak up. Dr. Thompson, I know I made a terrible mistake today. I was scared because of the break-ins, but that's no excuse for what I did to Danny. She turned to look directly at Danny, who was standing close to his father. Danny, I am so sorry I called the police on you. You didn't deserve that, and I hope you can forgive me for being so wrong about you. Danny looked at Betty for a moment, then glanced up at his father. Dr. Thompson gave him an encouraging nod, letting him know it was okay to respond however he felt comfortable. It's okay, Mrs. Henderson, Danny said quietly. I understand you were scared. I just wish you had asked me what I was doing instead of calling the police. Betty felt tears starting to form in her eyes. The kindness in Danny's response made her feel even worse about her actions, but also grateful for his maturity. You're a better person than I am, Betty said, her voice shaking slightly. Most adults wouldn't be so understanding after what I put you through. Dr. Thompson saw an opportunity to turn this painful experience into something positive for everyone. Mrs. Henderson, I can see that you genuinely regret what happened. The question is, what do we do now to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? Betty wiped her eyes and thought for a moment. I don't know. I guess I need to think differently about people I don't recognize. That's a start, Dr. Thompson said. But maybe we all need to do more than just think differently. Maybe we need to actually get to know each other better. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. I've been thinking about this for a while. We used to have block parties and neighborhood events, but we stopped doing them a few years ago. Maybe it's time to bring those back. Several neighbors nodded in agreement. Mrs. Chun said, I would love that. My family moved here 3 years ago, and we still don't feel like we really know anyone. That's exactly the problem, Dr. Thompson said. We live next to each other, but we don't really live with each other as a community. Danny had been listening to all the adults talk, and he finally spoke up. Maybe if people knew me, they wouldn't think I was scary just for walking down the street. His simple statement hit everyone hard. Here was a 14-year-old boy who had to worry about appearing threatening just for existing in his own neighborhood. Betty looked at Danny with fresh eyes. She could see now that he was just a regular teenager, polite, well-dressed, and clearly a good student if Mrs. Patterson was tutoring him. How had she ever thought he looked dangerous? Danny, Betty said, would you and your family be willing to come to dinner at my house this weekend? I know it doesn't make up for what I did, but I'd like to get to know you properly. Danny looked surprised by the invitation. He glanced at his father, who smiled and nodded. I'd like that, Danny said. But only if you promise not to call the police if I can't find your house. The joke broke some of the tension, and several people actually laughed. Even Betty smiled, grateful that Danny could find some humor in the situation. I promise, Betty said, and I'll make sure my house number is clearly visible. Dr. Thompson felt proud of both his son and Betty. It took courage for Danny to make that joke, and it took even more courage for Betty to invite them over after what had happened. I think that's a wonderful idea, Dr. Thompson said. Maybe we can use this as a starting point for bringing the whole neighborhood together. Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. I love this idea. I could help organize a neighborhood potluck dinner. Everyone could bring something to share, and we could all introduce ourselves properly. I could help with that too, Mrs. Chun offered. My husband makes amazing spring rolls that everyone would love. More neighbors started getting excited about the idea. Mr. Roberts said he could set up tables in his backyard, and another neighbor offered to make flyers to invite everyone on the street. As the conversation continued, Danny started to feel better about what had happened. It was still embarrassing and hurtful that someone had called the police on him, but maybe something good could come out of it after all. Dad, Danny whispered to his father, can we really trust that this will be different from now on? Dr. Thompson looked down at his son with love and honesty. I hope so, buddy. But even if it doesn't change everything, at least some people learned something important today. And you handled yourself with dignity and grace, which makes me very proud. Betty overheard their conversation and felt another wave of guilt and determination. Danny, I want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Not just with me, but with anyone in this neighborhood. How are you going to do that? Danny asked, genuinely curious, Betty thought. For a moment, well, first I'm going to get to know all the kids and families on our street. And if I ever see someone I don't recognize, I'm going to introduce myself instead of assuming the worst. Dr. Thompson nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach, Mrs. Henderson. As the group began to break up, everyone exchanging phone numbers and making plans for the neighborhood dinner, Danny felt like maybe this terrible day might actually lead to something better. Mrs. Patterson put her arm around Danny's shoulders. Are you ready for that math lesson now? After everything that's happened, I think you've earned the right to take it easy today. Actually, Danny said with a small smile, I think I'm ready to work harder than ever. This whole thing taught me that I need to be prepared for anything. Dr. Thompson watched his son walk toward Mrs. Patterson's house, feeling a mix of sadness and pride. Sadness that his child had to learn such a difficult lesson at such a young age, but pride in how Danny had handled himself throughout the entire ordeal. As he got back in his car to return to the hospital, Dr. Thompson reflected on what had happened. One person's fear and assumptions had nearly turned into something much worse, but the community's response gave him hope that real change was possible. 3 weeks later, the first annual Maple Street Block Party brought together more neighbors than anyone had expected. Danny helped serve food and met dozens of people who now knew him by name. And Betty, true to her word, had become one of the neighborhood's most welcoming residents, always ready to help newcomers feel at home. The incident that could have divided the community had instead brought them closer together, proving that sometimes the most difficult moments can lead to the most meaningful changes.